Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah Shaykhna.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Back to Basics. In this episode I wanted to discuss more about the human intellect and the way we stand out from amongst the rest of Allah's creation. My question in particular is how much reliance can we leave on the intellect? How much trust do we put in our own intellect to guide us and to enable us to make the correct decisions in our daily lives, or should we just rely solely on the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt that are presented to us?
That's a brilliant question, and I think that it's definitely one which a lot of us deep down ask ourselves, and to a certain degree allow me to say that sometimes I speak before I've thought out my sentence entirely, and I was about to say something which was very patronizing there, and that wasn't my intention. But one of the things I've realized, and I want us to all be aware of, that the things we're talking about, they're very sensitive because the gathering is quite informal. I'm trying to be as informal as possible and not give a formalized speech where I begin with all the formalities and ask for salawats and try and phrase the answer within a particular framework. So I'm trying to have this conversation as frankly as possible. One of the things that I think that has plagued many of us, and many a friend who, sometimes very intelligent people, can sometimes end up saying something which makes no sense whatsoever when it comes to this particular area. And that is to say that there are some people who talk about we're not going to give priority to the intellect because at the end of the day we have the words of Allah Muhammad, and that's fine. And so I've even heard some people say to me things like, well, if my intellect were to contradict what Allah Muhammad have said, then I'll go with Allah Muhammad. I think this, number one, fails to take into consideration what Allah Muhammad have actually said about the intellect. Number two, I think it's really a result of being quite naively preservationist about one's beliefs. And what do I mean by that? When we look at the different schools of rationality when it comes to religion in the past, we've had several. We've had people who believe primarily in sole rationality, and that itself is problematic because there's many things that rationality could never guide us to. So let me give you an example. Because our life on this earth is limited, there's some things that we can't explain and answer, we can't expect an answer to ad infinitum. And what I mean by that is, some people think that we can use the intellect to ask every single question. And they might ask, well, why do I pray 4 times for Dhuhr and Asr and 3 times for Maghrib? I believe if Allah Azza wa Jal were to try to explain the philosophy behind those things to all of us, it would just take up ridiculous amounts of time, because you and I on a day-to-day basis, we have to follow halal and haram and wajib and what have you. And so there's no way we could ask ourselves the philosophy behind every single action. But I do think that if we understand that Allah Azza wa Jal, who in His infinite wisdom has demonstrated His existence to us and demonstrated that He orders and prohibits things, then it's content for us to say that when it comes to certain orders and prohibitions, that we just trust in the knowledge of Allah Azza wa Jal. But at a higher point than that, see, that's fiqh. When it comes to aqeedah, we need to make sure that our aqeedah does not contradict rationality. Now, of course, the Ahlul Bayt have placed a strong emphasis upon rationality. And I always try to highlight a distinction between 3 different things. Number 1, rational. Things which rationality perceives and understands immediately. Number 2, irrational. Things which rationality could never accept. They would make no sense whatsoever. So for example, to say that the table is both round 100% round and 100% square, or 100% non-round at the same time. That would be an impossibility because two opposing, contradictory concepts are meeting at one point, which is impossible. But then we have the non-rational, and the non-rational merely means where we observe something that our rationality can't quite understand, but does not take a position against. So for example, rationally speaking, the concept of love is thought of as a concept which breeds itself. What I mean by that is it's cultivated and it grows. Yet we see many women who, when they're pregnant and when they do deliver birth to children, they would be willing to give their lives for those children despite having never met those children before, a form of sacrificial love. Now, my rationality can't understand that. Why? Because love is normally something that I need time in order to develop it. I need to grow in a relationship with someone before I could ever consider sacrificing myself for them. So, given that fact, we see that there's irrationality and there's non-rationality. Non-rationality is not rejected by the intellect. Irrationality is. We need to ensure that our beliefs are not irrational. They don't entail a necessary logical contradiction. And that's where we need to ensure that we are utilizing our intellect. When brothers tell me that, but surely if Ahlul Bayt say something, then what's my intellect? Well, brother, you have to understand that why did you come to believe in Ahlul Bayt in the first place? If you're going to tell me that you believed in Ahlul Bayt in the first place because your intellect guided you to them, then how does it make sense that you're now switching off your intellect now that you've reached them? And if you're going to tell me that, no, I've always believed in Ahlul Bayt, then that's fine. Switch off your intellect for everything else, because it seems when it comes to something as fundamental in your life as religion and heaven and hell, you want to switch off your intellect. I don't understand brothers that consider doing this, because you see, we as a species, let's look at some of the things we do. When it comes to choosing a spouse, yes, there's a degree of that emotional attachment involved, but we do use our intellect. Is she going to be a decent companion? Is she going to be someone that's going to serve my parents? Is she going to be someone who's understanding when difficult times come? These are all questions that our intellect would ask. But when it comes to, for example, choosing university, we would again ask the same questions. Well, is there a Muslim community in that city I'm going to? Is there access to halal food? What are the success rates of this university? How highly is this university rated? The department that I want to study in, how renowned are the experts in that department? How good a job am I going to get at the end of this degree? These are all questions we would be asking when making a choice like that. So why is it when it comes to religion, no, doesn't matter, switch off the intellect, what Ahlul Bayt say? Well, my friend, in order for you to establish, when we talk about the Ahlul Bayt being a hujjah from Allah Azza wa Jal, how does a hujjah demonstrate itself to people? It demonstrates itself to people by applying an argument that cannot be rejected in order for them to prove that they are a proof upon the people. They're not a proof upon the people if people don't recognize them as a proof in the first place. So we need to be quite clear that the intellect plays this heavy role, and we need to not come up with, dare I say, cheap sound bites that if the Ahlul Bayt say something to me, even if my intellect goes against it, I'll take it. Because at the end of the day, the only way you're understanding that rawaya is with your intellect. Perhaps you could argue that I've misunderstood the rawaya, but you could never argue that Ahlul Bayt are telling me that something which is logically and rationally impossible could ever be the case. Otherwise, I'm no different from any other religion which is based upon a fallacious premise.
We'll just be fanatics by the end of it.
Of course.
So obviously there is an importance in using your intellect when discussing the religion and the Ahlul Bayt. But in your opinion, is there a harm to using our intellect to an extreme scale?
What do you mean by an extreme scale?
Like, for example, the way I I see it as, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to leave everything to our intellect, He wouldn't have brought down the message, He wouldn't have revealed Himself to us through the prophets and the Ahlul Bayt. He would have left it to our intellect for us to find the right path and to discover the truth and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we constantly use our intellect as a barometer of truth and falsehood, could we reach a point where we start rejecting authentic narrations or teachings of the Ahlul Bayt?
Only if we use our intellect in a way which conflates its natural abilities. So for example, a few episodes back we cited the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alif Lam Mim, ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب. So we talk about this world of Alim al-Ghayb, the realm of the unseen. Now, if I were to use my intellect in a fallacious manner, I might say, well, I can't see it, and therefore it doesn't exist. And that would be fallacious, but that's not truly applying the intellect. What that's doing is being stubborn, and that's actually being empiricist. And we described the downfall of empiricism recently, where we said that not only reality is not only that which can be detected by the five senses. Or for example, when it comes to a law, and let me give a practical analogy. Let's say, for example, that the law states that, let's talk about the law of purifying things. Yeah. Imagine I were to say, well, no, scientifically, that doesn't purify you. Like, there's still some remnants of najasa upon you when you do that. Then that would also be stupid because, again, what you're doing is you're taking things too literally. And what you're not understanding is that the person that designed the law is the person who's defined what najasa is. So when it comes to issues of najasa and uncleanliness or impurities, it's mas'ala i'tibariyah. What do I mean by that? It's something which is recognized by the person who has awareness of it. If I, for example, had a hand which has something, which touched something which was najis, my palm is wet, and I come and shake your hand, but you're not aware of the fact that there's najasa on my hand, you're not affected at all because you didn't know. So that's what we mean by najasa being mas'ala i'tibariyah. It's something that needs to be given recognition by the other person. So when it comes to these things, we can see definitely that if you were to apply your intellect in a fallacious way, as I've seen some people do, it would certainly be problematic. In regards to, well, if our intellect was sufficient, then we would be guided without the need for revelation. No, because as I've said, our intellect is unable to guide us to every single moral truth. Our intellect is unable to guide us to what are the taklifat from Allah Azza wa Jal. Why? Because the taklif has been written by Allah Azza wa Jal. It's not something which my intellect is able to unlock just like that. I might be able to understand certain aspects of it, but no, I need a lawgiver to give me a law. In regards to the person that just has the intellect and doesn't have access to revelation, our aqidah actually teaches that such a person is mustad'af, and using his intellect alone, which is a hujjah upon him, he would be able to determine much of what is right and what is wrong. For example, the intellect is sufficient for teaching us not to do shirk towards Allah Azza wa Jal.
Absolutely. But at the same time, our intellect isn't sufficient enough, for example, to do tafsir of the Quran, which is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yes.
We do require a greater intellect or a higher intellect, which is the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. Is that their purpose? Is that what they serve to us?
Well, you must understand that there's several reasons for that. In the same way that in studying literature, we have a science called hermeneutics. I can't just pick up a book in Shakespearean English and read it according to the vernacular understanding of modern 21st century London ghetto talk. I have to be familiar with the context in which the book is written. I have to be familiar with the language in which the book is written. And more importantly, I have to be familiar with the tone in which the author is speaking. When it comes to the Quran clearly states that it has ayat which are muhkam And it has ayat which are mutashabih. And yes, I can't use my intellect to interpret it. We need certain tools beyond that in order to understand the Quran.
So, Shaykhna, thank you very much for clearing up the notion of the intellect and to what extent we can use it and shouldn't be applying it to our aqidah, and also the importance of having it in our day-to-day lives.
Yes.
Inshallah, in the next coming episodes, we'll delve deeper into this topic.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much for your time.
No problem.